There are about 1.7 billion Muslims living around the globe. That's about 20% of the world's population. But the 9/11 terror attacks on the United States that killed almost 3,000 people gave rise to anti-Muslim sentiment in America that some see as Islamophobia. And the issue of how Muslims are treated in the US has also surfaced in this year's presidential election, with a call by Republican Donald Trump to ban Muslims from entering the country. Well, joining me now to discuss the issue is Arsalan Iftikhar. He is an international human rights lawyer and journalist, and he's the author of Scapegoats: How Islamophobia Helps Our Enemies and Threatens Our Freedoms. Aslam, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Anand.
Nice to have you here. You say in the introduction to your book that your life really began on September 11th, 2001. You write, and I'm quoting here, because that was the exact moment in time when my country was attacked by people who simultaneously hijacked my religion. How much did that day change lives for Muslims in the United States?
Well, Anand, I think that it was a game changer for all 7 million American Muslims who were living here in the United States, primarily because of the fact that before September 11th, 2001, the vast majority of Americans knew nothing about Islam or Muslims. And sadly, that one tragedy, that one terrorist attack sort of set the frameworks and the meta-narratives that we've seen for the last 15 years when it comes to discussing Islam and Muslims within the American socio-political zeitgeist, somewhere in a nexus between religion and terrorism. And so I think that for many American Muslims, especially those of us who are born and raised here, it was sort of a call to action in not only reclaiming our faith from the terrorists who attacked this country, but also defending our way of life, defending our identity, and trying to educate the general American public as to the real teachings of Islam and the beliefs of over 1 billion Muslims today.
Now, the title of your book is Scapegoats. Why do you believe Muslims in the West are being treated as scapegoats?
Well, I think it's first important to point out that the title Scapegoats was chosen because virtually every minority demographic group in the world today, and especially in Western diasporas, has been a scapegoat in their adopted homeland at some point or another. So, for example, if you look at the American civil rights history, even just from the turn of the 20th century, we had Catholic immigrants coming to the shores of New York who were being persecuted by the native Germanic Protestants, which was made famous by the Martin Scorsese film Gangs of New York. We saw over 140,000 Japanese Americans who were interned in internment camps for the duration of World War II. We've seen anti-Semitism throughout the 20th century. Obviously, the Jim Crow South and the African American civil rights struggle, which still continues until this very day. And after 9/11, and especially within our American political rhetoric and zeitgeist, we're seeing Islam and Muslims being used as a current scapegoat political football that some people, some politicians, primarily in the Republican Party, are trying to use in order to score cheap political points. And the key here, Ananda, is tomorrow it will be somebody else. Right. And so that's why it's important for us to speak out as allies, because if it's not us today, it will be us tomorrow.
Right, Muslims are the scapegoats. Isn't it ironic, though, because you get this knee-jerk reaction when something happens. Oh, it's Islam that's caused this. It's Muslims that's caused it. But the people who've suffered most from it are, in fact, Muslims.
That's a great point that you bring up. You know, the Countering Terrorism Center at West Point Academy once came out with a report that showed that 94% of Al-Qaeda and ISIS attack victims are Muslims themselves. And the FBI here in the United States has come out with reports saying that the vast majority of terrorist attacks that occur on domestic soil here are not by Muslims, but they're by white right-wing militia extremists. But if you look at our media narratives today, both in the United States and the West, generally speaking, the term terrorism has been co-opted to only apply when brown-skinned men with foreign-sounding names commit acts of mass murder, and not when white Christian men commit those same acts of mass murder as well.
Right. Well, what we're seeing also right now is the fact that this has been exploited by politicians in the United States. Of course, we're in the middle of an election campaign right now. We've seen how it's been exploited. We have Donald Trump, who's drawn a great deal of condemnation and at the same time a great deal of support for saying that he is going to ban Muslims from entering the United States. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
Now, when you hear comments like that, how much damage does it do to the relationship between Muslims and others in this country, to Muslims themselves?
Well, you know what I say is that if you can replace the word Muslim with Jews and sound like a Nazi, you probably shouldn't say these statements. And what Donald Trump has said, not only with the Muslim ban, but other Republican presidential candidates before him. Let's not forget that Texas Senator Ted Cruz once said that he believes that we should patrol Muslim neighborhoods. I can tell you that if you patrolled Muslim neighborhoods, you would only find the best falafels and kebabs that he's ever had. We had Dr. Ben Carson, who said that he doesn't even believe that Muslims should be allowed to run for president. And what's most disconcerting about Donald Trump's call for a ban on Muslims is that recent exit polls in Republican primaries have found that almost 65 to 70% of Republican primary voters in the states of Pennsylvania, New York, and others actually agree with this ban. So in a way, Donald Trump is just voicing something that a relatively large, significant swath of the American public believes today about Islam and Muslims.
Donald Trump made those statements after that attack in California where you had this husband and wife team that killed 14 people. You've had numerous other attacks over the years. You've, of course, had 9/11, as we've been talking as well. And then the common narrative that's come about after that is when something like this happens, it's Muslims, it's Islam. How do you dispel that? How do you break that narrative?
Well, you know, in 2015, when the San Bernardino attacks happened in December, before that, there were approximately 350 mass shootings that had occurred in the United States up until that point that year. And 99% of them were not committed by Muslims. But when we had the San Bernardino attacks, it was instantly labeled an act of terrorism, when 1 week prior, a white man named Robert Deere walked into the Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs with a self-professed Christianist ideology. His own ex-wife testified in open court, according to the New York Times, that he viewed himself as a soldier for Christ and committed an act of mass murder. We never saw that referred to as an act of terrorism. 6 months before that, Anand, we had Dylan Roof, a 21-year-old white supremacist who walked into an African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina, sat in Bible class with them for over an hour, and then proceeded with his race war ideology to slaughter 9 innocent African-Americans, including a state senator for whom he had specifically asked for by name. That was never referred to as an act of domestic terrorism. And again, this is the double standard that I'm talking about in my book, Scapegoats, is that, again, there's one standard that is put in place for Muslims in the United States where we have a presumption of guilt, where Muslims in America traditionally are, we're guilty until we prove ourselves innocent, and everyone else is afforded the presumption of innocent, where you're innocent until you're proven guilty.
So those instances that you mentioned, that's treated in this country as what, crimes?
Yeah, those are called mass shootings or lone wolf attacks. But again, even if it's a lone wolf attack, but if he happens to have olive skin, have a foreign-sounding Arab or Muslim name, he's automatically going to be framed a terrorist. And it's that double standard that, again, is leading to a lot of the divides that we're seeing in the East and West today. You know, we have to understand that Donald Trump's comments, you know, cannot be viewed in a vacuum. I mean, his sound bites on the Muslim ban were found in an Al-Shabaab recruitment video, you know, halfway across the world in Somalia. And so, again, you know, not only is this rhetoric hurtful to 7 million American Muslims who call the United States our home, but it actually makes us less safe as a country. And so that's why it's important for politicians from all political parties to condemn this rhetoric. And sadly, this is something that we're not seeing a great deal of pushback on in any sort of meaningful way when several major Republican candidates are espousing these sorts of views.
Well, talking about pushback, I mean, as soon as you label something terrorism, that's a very loaded term. It comes, all kinds of connotations come with that. Why aren't these things treated as crimes? As, you know, these people who perpetrate this as criminals?
Well, and they are crimes. And again, as a lawyer, you know, my job is to, you know, make sure that all crimes are called crimes and that there's no double standard that's put in place. That if a brown person commits an act of mass murder, that's categorized as the same thing as if a white man commits that same act. And it's this disparity. I mean, the American legal and justice system, you know, has always disparately, you know, punished minorities and people of color, historically speaking. And so, I mean, this goes to our greater narratives in terms of, you know, is there really equality in the United States, or are there two parallel systems of justice for the majority populations and for minority populations as well?
The very respected Muslim scholar, Reza Aslan, who wrote the foreword for your book, he's been very critical of the media. He's been very critical of political personalities, as you've been as well. And he said, one of his quotes is that, in their view, every Muslim is a closet jihadist just waiting for the opportunity to bring down Western civilization as we know it today. That's a pretty strong statement. Is he right?
I think he is. I mean, again, whenever we hear about any sort of mass shooting in the United States, as I mentioned, 350 of them, as a Muslim public intellectual, I am always holding my breath because, again, if the moment comes out that the perpetrator is a brown Muslim man, we know that the entire framework, the rhetoric around that act, like San Bernardino, is going to be completely different than the 349 mass shootings that were committed predominantly by white Christian men. Again, just a week before, you had the Planned Parenthood shooting, Dylan Roof in South Carolina. And a lot of it has to go to the narratives that the media perpetuates. And again, the vast majority of the American and the general global public gets their information from our global mainstream media. And so, I mean, there is a responsibility between journalists, to have editorial standards in place and not call something an act of terrorism just when a brown Muslim man does it, right, and not that same act when a white Christian man does that same thing.
All right, let's talk about the media. You've been very critical of the media. When I talk about media, I'm not talking about, the internet. I'm talking about mainstream media that you mentioned a moment ago as well. You have said that there is a media crusade against Islam. What is the evidence there? What is the mainstream media doing?
Well, I think, every journalist knows that there's a very famous adage in journalism that if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so the more sensationalistic the story, the more ratings you can get, the more likely you are, to get the ratings and, meet the commercial interests of your news networks or your newspapers or your radio stations. And, again, when it comes to the discussions of Islam or Muslims, it's really important to keep in mind that the vast majority of stories that have been done over the last 15 years have always revolved around either religion or terrorism, right? And again, as you know, with the 24/7 constant news cycles that we have in the world today, we need to fill airtime. And again, we're always looking for, the East versus West, black versus white dichotomy of screaming talking heads. And, a lot of times we see news networks around the world that find, these, crazy Muslims who are not representative of any sort of Muslim community, but are, espousing a view that they feel will help to generate ratings. And again, we have to understand that journalism's primary goal should always be to inform in a dispassionate manner. And I think that is where we're losing a lot of our bearings today when it comes to the media in general. And obviously, we're not talking about any particular news outlet in general, but again, just this whole 24/7 need for if it bleeds, it leads, and trying to get the sound bites that will, make videos go viral. That's something that I believe that the media has some responsibility in perpetuating.
You've also been critical of law enforcement agencies, especially the New York Police Department, intelligence agencies. Why?
Well, in 2012, Matt Apuzzo and Adam Goldman from the Associated Press won the Pulitzer Prize for a series of investigative articles on the NYPD's extensive spying program on the American Muslim community in New York and the New Jersey metropolitan area, where these documents and these interviews and these articles found that the NYPD was basically, they were planting informants and snitches inside of Muslim communities, trying to entrap Muslims into talking about, committing acts of terrorism when the vast majority of these people, couldn't find a light switch in their own closet. And they even went so far as to send undercover informants on student whitewater rafting trips with College Muslim Students Association. They were also investigating Muslim Students Associations at Yale University and Ivy League schools, and sending people to hookah joints and kebab restaurants, trying to infiltrate the Muslim community. And this is something that really has created a lot of distrust between law enforcement agencies and the American Muslim community at a time where the conversations actually need to be even more closely guarded and valued. And it's important that, again, American Muslims are seen as part of the solution and not part of the problem. And the NYPD spying program did not help very much in bridging that divide.